Thank you, Tamima. Next, we've got Şafak Pavey, somebody who I admire very much indeed. She's a Turkish opposition MP, so she's in a particularly difficult position at the moment, but she's also got lots of other strings to her bow, which you can read about in the pack there. So here's Şafak now, who's going to tell us about her work in human rights too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry, for the kind introduction and the invitation to be with our society today. It's a great honor. Deborah Levin gave us a great tour of the society's background and the secularism in the UK, with actually something that I envied a lot, because she presented it with such joy and humor. And I do hope one day, as the seculars of Turkey, we will be able to tell about our story in such a humorous and joyful way, knowing that the vein is still alive there and our survival continued. This century has been the host of many firsts in the human history. As we all know, science and technology has been advancing at a speed that has never been witnessed before in the previous millennia. These advancements have changed us beyond our power of imagination. As for the social changes, we are at a point when, for the first time ever, the citizens of one country can have a decisive say in the selection of another country's prime minister, members of parliament, and so on. Such as, for instance, in my country, Turkish migrant groups in Europe have a determining factor in shaping the political map. You may have been following also Merkel trying to remind that she is the chancellor of the country to the migrant groups. By the 1800s, the world population had just reached 1 billion, but now is 7 times more, only in a matter of 1 century. This is a sociological condition that had been never experienced before. Our natural resources are being exhausted at the same speed and at times even times more, higher speed. We need to come to our senses quickly and realize the common global dangers that we all in this society are aware of. And yet, in the world society, we are too busy fighting amongst ourselves, missing the very precious chance of thinking about solving bigger problems that we're facing. So I want to focus where it stems from when it comes to human rights and secularism idea, when actually there's a contradiction that was faced in the near past. When the world, Cold War came to an end and the world was unipolar again, we excitedly thought that racism, discrimination, and sexism were being buried in the history also. As a member of 90s generation, we were reading the world's developments by the advances made in human rights that stemmed with the advancements that was made by the struggle of previous generations than us, with the secular thought behind it. And with their push and opening the path for us, we were able to access our rights freedoms as children, women, persons with disabilities, LGBTI members, minorities. Then came the participatory democracy concept, human rights through new mediums for freedom of expression, digital freedom such as social media, strong messages back then when civil society was pushing for human rights platforms and human rights formation to happen in the United Nations as well. Strong messages were conveyed by the international community and civil society having reached a consensus on universal human rights. The developments in that field made discrimination unacceptable and shameful at the level of states. It became a criteria and condition for the states to be member of this club, to accept, at least on the surface, to be part of the international conventions, to accept these values. And human rights values, respecting them, turned into a core value at their level. In the past 25 years, developments and changes within the international community strengthened multilateral human rights actors and procedures. Many countries have accepted human rights conventions as a less controversial issue and as a topic for their foreign policy agendas much more easily. Civil society have become increasingly significant in the political landscape. However, human rights still provoke political controversy. The record of national practice, of course, leaves much to be desired. There have been and are still too many violations happening that still needs to be adequately addressed, or they remain unaddressed by the international community. However, we can't just leave it to the legislation, the human rights. Speaking as a lawmaker in a country in the middle of the conflict of what we are talking about right now, cultural conflict I'm talking about, and under a state of emergency, I can see a much stronger challenge than changing laws in compliance with the international law, and that is the resistance of traditions. I'm very often faced with the underlying thoughts deeply embedded in various societies, including mine, that question fundamental freedoms. Also Tahmine has mentioned of it, saying that instead of freedoms that does not contribute with a meaning to my life, I choose traditions that give meaning to one's life. I believe this is the main challenge that we will be facing in the next 2 decades, to find a way to reconcile freedoms with tradition. It is not the states that need a consensus now, it is resisting cultures. For instance, let's look at the ongoing phenomenon of acid attacks against women following rejection of marriage. In the concerned countries, in the geography that my country shares with, the lawmakers pass concrete laws and introduce severe penalties to fight against it. However, the numbers of victims either remain the same or increases. In this case of law enforcement, the cultural willpower acts much stronger than the political or legal willpower. Elsewhere, child soldiers in the same geography I'm talking about are recruited, child brides are wed, having been bought from their families. In most of these cases, there is not much trace of the use of force on the surface, as the families and receivers all seem to be in agreement with each other. Then who do we struggle against? My answer is that we struggle against a deep culture which sees these practices acceptable. That is not in compliance with human rights principles. So the reality was that we found ourselves actually amid unforeseen damaging outcomes rooted in the Cold War. Now I realize in my adulthood, the big propaganda war actually never stopped. It only changed its appearance. In the developing countries like mine, as religious identities replaced right-wing and left-wing political affiliations, the victims of propaganda became the secular minorities. And most interestingly, in my country, those back then who shouted loudest, "Yankee, go home," during the Cold War, immigrated to Western countries. And those who had shouted loudest back then, "Communists, go to Moscow," fled to Soviet countries. Even though the philosophical inspiration can be traced to Western political thought, the clash in the developing countries was never about those who believed in socialism and those who defended capitalism. No matter what the fighting parties call themselves, the real fight has always been between those who wanted a secular lifestyle and those who wanted a lifestyle governed by religion. Turkey was the only example of secular Islamic society, and here the deep cultural fault line has collapsed. Our secular parents lost their cause because of Cold War dynamics, I realize now. Both blocs did not shy from employing their great power, political power of religion, the great political power of religion, as a tool to advance their political gains in the developing countries. Today, we are reaping the fruit of toying with religion. We are dealing with the radicalization of Islam and the propaganda of political Islam, and we still have to find a way in our struggle with it. Ironically, the West used its power to destroy the youth of developing countries who wanted to live by universal values. Now it is too late even to grieve this fact. The cultural war we are experiencing at the global level now is the most important result of the end of Cold War. The cliff that divides us today is greater and more dangerous than the one back in bipolar times. It is not the physical or financial borderlines that separate us today, but cultural borderlines. This abyss appeared right at the moment when we thought that living together in global peace is finally possible. This was when the balance was tilted and a globally asymmetric war began. The policy of international community did not change after the Cold War. As the United States continued its strife on a democracy based on Western ideals, it was expected for the rest of the world to build societies around modern principles. However, what followed was much blood and irreversible changes. Not only did we face continuous conflicts, with the revival of religious traditions, God's role in politics in my region was rekindled. Today, the post-Cold War's proposed political model for the world was democracy, which is the democracy for everyone. But that does not seem to lead to the desired results. The models of government that were presented did not remain as they were. In fact, just as peculiar as sand turns into glass, the cultures that implemented its ideals have transformed into something new. They emerged in completely different forms than originally intended, wearing religious clothes as well. Not only did democracy itself mutate in this century, the appearance of democracy drastically changed in the countries it spread to as well. And as I said, in the Middle East, this has become to the fore, wearing the clothes of strict religious dogmas. This century has seen the same political principles applied in different ways to create very different political systems. That's the contradiction. This is the reason why, when Western methods of solving political problems are applied in these countries, they rarely lead to successful results. By now, none of us knows how to deal with the siege of radical religion in which societies that had hoped for change of regime or for democracy to find themselves. This is not only our crisis, it's the crisis of the modern world. Our passports are telling us that we can travel anywhere, but the cliff opened by religion is deeper than ever. A passport is not a sign of loyalty, unlike the unshakable fidelity created through the ties of religious culture. East and West almost no longer exist. The modern West carries within it a strong East through human connection and the global migration results. The East has its share of Western soldiers and Western capital. The borders of the East may be in tatters, but the identity of the West, the very composition of it, is constantly changing borders too. Most of you must be wondering what is going on in my country. No doubt, the story of my country, which contains the deepest cultural conflicts, is indeed also the story of the current world. In conclusion, what should we do? We, the secularists who believe in living together, as the title highlight of this conference, how can we get out of this global struggle? How can we survive? How can we try to be and live together, exist together? These are, of course, heavy questions, and nonetheless, it's our duty to look for answers, and we're trying it here. I believe there may be a few things that would benefit the world. The first is perhaps stop imposing Western-style democracy on societies that have decided to live by God-given commandments. If they resist so much, then they have to decide on the destiny themselves. We do not have to change human rights principles to please migrant cultures, and we may get better results if we try to change the local cultures to fit the higher ceiling of international law standards. I do not think that it is sensible to allow the establishments in host countries to justify traditional institutions in the name of cultural rights that often made life hell for those migrants who fled from it. Becoming included is neither a sin nor a crime, nor does it mean ceasing to exist, is another reality that with the migrant cultures has to be convinced on. It means being included in the common life. This is something that we can learn only if we bring down strong barriers between us. The last and the most important duty, let us remember the significant role of secularism in promoting human rights at the very start of it. When we talk about cultural rights then, we need to grant the same protection to secularism, secular lifestyle, as we do to religion. Let us not forget that many of the values we possess today are our inheritance from the struggle of the previous generation secularists. That is why, right here, I would like to congratulate once again National Secular Society for achieving the consultative status as a civil society vis-à-vis the UN through ECOSOC. Now we can lobby for secular education. We can monitor the international law instruments that is available for monitoring human rights and for the protection of secularism as much as faith in those conventions. Thank you very much. Thank you.